I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. We had a family with 6 kids, good Irish Catholic family. Everybody cherished each other. My parents were wonderful people. We had food to eat. I had friends to play with, and I had one sport that I could play reasonably well. Basketball was my babysitter. I remember when JFK was elected president.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing.
I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs.
The Beatles.
There was certainly a lot going on in the world.
And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
So eventually I went to Georgia Tech on an NROTC scholarship, and my initial thought was to fly jet airplanes, which lasted until the first time I saw a Navy SEAL demonstration. It was in the summer of 1969,
All-engine
the same period as the moon landing.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
It's one small step for man.
They were both amazing events, but to see a bunch of people fly in, jump out of a perfectly good helicopter into the water, then several minutes later to see the entire other side of the bay blow up. It was just an amazing display. From that moment, my heart was set on going to BUD/S and being a SEAL.
He then went on to complete BUD/S and did time as a platoon leader at UDD-12 and then at SEAL Team 1. In 1976, he went to medical school and eventually went on to undersea medical officer training and was assigned to the Navy Experimental Dive Unit.
When they found out that they had a former SEAL who was there as a medical officer, they knew right away what I was going to be doing, so they assigned me all of the projects that had to do with SEALs and SEAL operations. One of the most important was the SEAL oxygen exposure limits.
Frank almost single-handedly rewrote all of the Navy dive tables as to how you approach decompression, how long you can stay below the surface, decompression stops, all of that. That's Frank. The thread I see every place he was and is where he sees the ability to make it better, he'll insert himself and he'll put a team together and he'll get things done and then he'll move on to the next mission.
So as we started doing these oxygen dives, it turns out that I was remarkably sensitive to oxygen. And very shortly after the dive series began, I had an oxygen convulsion, and then a second convulsion, and then another toxicity episode after that. You've heard of the canary in the coal mine. I was the canary in the wet pot. If I could swim a profile, I felt very good about recommending it for somebody else.
Frank has an interesting continuum in life, in the military. At every place he was, he took his knowledge and applied it to that environment to make it better. So that's a thread I see through his whole life. And even today, Frank is still as curious, inquisitive about everything, always asking, can we do it better? Can we do it faster? Can we do it cheaper? It's part of his DNA.
I was at the Experimental Diving Unit from 1981 to 1986, and then it was time to go back and learn to be a specialist in medicine. So after 3 years learning to do eye surgery, I was assigned to the Naval Hospital Pensacola. But several months after I got to Pensacola, I got a phone call. As it turns out, the SEALs needed better medical support. They needed doctors who knew what was going on with the SEAL community. So for the next 14 years, as the director of the Navy SEAL Biomedical Research Program, I was able to do eye surgery one week and go out and do SEAL biomedical R&D the other week. At that time, and we're talking 1991, 92, if you needed glasses, unless they were really minimal glasses, then you couldn't be a SEAL or a Navy diver or a pilot. And I became aware that There was a new type of laser refractive surgery that was a much better procedure than the old type of refractive surgery. So we did the first research program looking at active duty Navy members having laser refractive eye surgery done, and it worked great.
And so Frank really led the effort to allow these folks to get the newer laser refractive surgery. We've been able to bring into the special operations community really thousands of people who otherwise would not have been able to serve.
Another thing that became immediately obvious was that the overwhelming majority of people who die from wounds sustained in combat die before they get to the hospital. 7% of the individuals who died in one large study in Vietnam died simply because they bled to death from an arm or a leg wound. Their lives could have been saved with just a tourniquet. That's more people than were killed at Pearl Harbor. That's more people than were killed at 9/11. It's a staggering number. So what were we teaching medics and corpsmen at the time to do for casualties? And if we were wrong on something that was that important, what else were we wrong on?
By 1989, when I first enlisted in the Army as a combat medic, the techniques of battlefield medicine were relatively unchanged since the Civil War, believe it or not. We were taught that tourniquets were a last resort. We should only use them if everything else had failed. And we learned other modalities that honestly were not all that effective at saving casualties' lives.
So we wound up taking the entire list of things that corpsmen and medics were trained to do and looked at the evidence base for every one of those things. After 3 years of research, we published a paper called Tactical Combat Casualty Care in Special Operations, TC3 for short, that basically rewrote everything that medics did for casualties on the battlefield.
Publishing a paper doesn't get the clinical recognition and translation to the field. So Frank knew that he had to impress upon the commanders, the tactical commanders, that this was necessary. But recognizing that the science wasn't enough, we had to figure out how to get influencers that understood at a tactical level to say this is good for our troops. So I think that's the next level of expertise that he brought to the argument.
In 2003, Frank served as a joint task force surgeon in Afghanistan and got to see firsthand the role that the Tactical Combat Casualty Care guidelines were playing on the battlefield. But unfortunately, the guidelines themselves and the techniques that they advocated, to include the use of tourniquets, had not spread completely throughout the special operations community or throughout the military. And so in 2004, when Frank took over as the SOCOM surgeon, his experiences on the battlefield fueled his resolve. And one of his first questions to the staff was, how much do we know about the deaths of special operators in the recent wars? And the answer was little to nothing. But he knew that the one person who could help him get the kind of data and do the kind of analysis he needed was Colonel John Holcomb, a trauma surgeon who was then the director of the Institute for Surgical Research in San Antonio.
Data and emotions and experience on the battlefield is a powerful combination. And at that time, had been asked and assumed command of the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research and was trauma consultant to the Army Surgeon General. And as we talked about this problem of data, I said, well, let's go get the data, right? The data is in the autopsy reports of the soldiers who've died on the battlefield. It's special operators. And we very clearly showed that the majority of the potentially preventable deaths were from extraneous bleeding. And it was the data that convinced the leaders of US SOCOM to mandate that everybody on the battlefield carry tourniquets and know how to use them.
So armed with that information, we went up to brief Admiral Olson and General Brown and said, sirs, our mantra is humans are more important than hardware. We have a chance to make that happen, to turn that into a reality. And God bless them. They supported us tremendously. We got $7 million for a program that turned out to be called the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Transition Initiative. It needed to be done, and U.S. SOCOM had a great track record of stepping up, and they stepped up this time. And fast forward to 2018, the Department of Defense made it mandatory for everybody in the U.S. military to be trained and be prepared to execute TC3 if they were caring for a wounded serviceman or woman.
All weapon systems start in soft. All weapon systems that are effective spread across the conventional force. And TC3 is not any different. So if it wasn't for Frank Butler, thousands and thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, special operators would be dead. In the statement.
Frank embodies all of the elements of a special operator. He's honest, he has great integrity, he's intensely curious, and always mission-focused. Because of that, he's been able to transform what used to be doctrine that was wrong to what we do today that saves lives.
But you know, Frank couldn't do this without his family and without his wife. Deb Butler deserves really special recognition.
Being able to actually make the right thing happen is not always so easy. But you know, God has a plan, and I'm glad this was His plan for me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Captain Frank K. Butler.